Well, one man who's good at political rumination and post-election assessment is Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who joins me now in the studio. Prof, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
How serious a moment is this for Nigeria, do you think? Is this country in a major crisis and at a critical turning point?
Not necessarily. First point is that elections are always moments of intense emotions in the history of this country. And it takes days for people to look back and have a more balanced view on the elections. And the balanced view will show there are positives and there are negatives of the last election, and that at this point, the way forward is to look on the positives, understand the negatives, and embark on advocacy to ensure those negatives do not replicate themselves. Think a moment about 2007, which was the worst election in the Fourth Republic, where the chair of the Electoral Commission of the time would simply sit in his office, write results, and announce them. At the end of that election, Nigerians were dumbfounded, they were stunned, and they felt completely dejected. What did they do? They decided to reflect. How do we make sure we don't have elections as bad as the 2007 elections occurring in this country again? Since then, we've never had an election as bad as the 2007 elections. So my spirit today says, look at the positives, look at lessons learned, and map a better and greater future where Nigerians would be very happy at the end of every election.
Well, that's a positive spin to it, but looking at it from the point of view of a young person who's just reached the age, the voting age, and never, I mean, was virtually in diapers in 2007, and this has been their first experience of Nigerian elections, full of promise, full of hope, and then crushing disappointment. From that point of view, has Nigeria pretty much hit the buffers when it comes to conducting free, fair, and credible elections? Because it tried the manual system, it didn't work, and it tried the digital system, and that hasn't worked either.
Well, I think the positives for young Nigerians is that it took a very long time for them to see the benefits of engaging in the electoral process itself. And that happened for the first time with this election. A lot of young people got highly mobilized, engaged the electoral process, campaigned, and had a lot of hope that this is the election that will fix all of Nigeria's problems. For many of these young people, they would be in shock and deep disappointment. There's a risk that their attitude might be to give up on Nigerian elections. I think that will be a wrong approach. I think that will be negative, and that wouldn't serve their purpose, because this country is what they have the time to live in. And those of us at the edge will be sliding to the next world very soon. The point for them really is to say that look at these elections. It reestablished certain fundamentals about Nigerian elections. The most important one of which is that just because you have power doesn't mean you can swing elections to your benefit. Many extremely powerful people and parties found themselves in a situation where the powers of incumbency could not guarantee their political future. This is a huge gain for young Nigerians in particular, who for a long time had had the attitude that these incumbents would always abuse their powers of incumbency to make things impossible for new forces to emerge. And what we saw in these elections, we've never had an election in the history of this country where so many incumbents couldn't deliver on their electoral wishes. That's a huge positive. And I think I'll call on these young people to look at that positive.
So in a sense, things are inching forward. You talked about the disaster of the 2007 elections. As the legal challenge progresses through the court system towards the first hearing, does your conviction grow or lessen that the whole election was one big political stitch-up? I mean, the presidential election, as you assess the various sides to it.
Well, you know, I was watching a clip by Olisa Agbakoba the other day where he was expressing his views about the involvement of the judiciary. And he made the important point that he's extremely worried that it used to be possible to predict where the judiciary is going, because once you know the facts, you can tell the direction they are going. But he says he's afraid he no longer has that confidence that you can predict where the judiciary is going, and that therefore something very funny is happening with the judiciary. I also watched, I think it was on your program yesterday, Femi Falana, another legal luminary, making the case that one of the specificities of this country is that we have more cases around elections that go to court than any other country in the world. What all this tells us is that one of the worrying realities of our contemporary Nigeria is that the judiciary has become an active player in deciding electoral outcomes, and they are not always doing it for the good reason. This should disturb us, and this should lead us to a situation where elections should be decided at the polling booth, where people express their votes, and those votes are counted, and the clear results are announced, and that's the end of the story. That's where we want to be at. And therefore, I'm worried about the role of the judiciary. I'm particularly worried about certain gains we've made in law, such as the fact that you can't say you are the candidate for an election if you didn't contest in the primaries. We had a Senate president, we have a Senate president who we all saw did not participate in an election, and the judiciary declares him as the candidate for that primary elections. That disturbs me, that worries me, and I look at foreboding at some of the shocks that may emerge from the judiciary as we move forward.
And in the context of what you just said, because, I mean, unfortunately, the whole elections moved to the judiciary. So there's nothing we can do. We can't extricate them from the process. We have to depend on them to help us get through the process. Are you consoled by the fact that the wheel of justice may be turning slowly, but at least they are in motion by way of the courts?
Well, I think it's important that contentious electoral issues end up in court. But I think it's also important that we begin to express clearly and loudly our understanding of what the courts are doing sometimes. And when they go out of what we consider to be the realms of the reasonable or the realms of justice, we should proclaim it high and loud. I think in this country we are too respectful of the judiciary, and maybe we have to start talking to them the way we talk to ourselves. And then they may begin to understand that they are not our overlords, who can disregard the law as ordinary people understand it and impose judgments that are blatantly irrational, wrong, and against the interest of justice.
That's a very good point that you make. And again, in that regard, how do you assess the grounds? I mean, I know you're not a lawyer, but you're one of the most, astute generalists that I know, who keeps a very close eye on things. How do you assess the grounds on which the two parties, the PDP and Labour, and their presidential candidates have filed their legal challenges at the Election Tribunal?
I think their grounds, to me, make a lot of sense. They are raising lots of questions of law, and I think the resolution of those questions of law could lead to interesting results. The fact of the matter is that, given the nature of our judicial system, it's extremely difficult to show that a party that has been declared winner actually did not win, because the onus of proof is on the petitioner to show that every vote assigned to the winner is in fact falsely assigned. And when you are talking of 8 million votes, showing that a significant percentage of those 8 million votes were wrongly assigned or allocated becomes an extremely difficult thing.
Or at least the difference between the other candidates.
Because you're still talking of millions between them. So I think it's, in the best of situations, extremely difficult to do, and that therefore the advantage, as it were, is always with the person that has been declared winner. I recall when we were in the Electoral Reform Committee set up by the late President Yar'Adua, we reflected a lot about that issue. And part of our reflection is that, shouldn't the onus of proof be on the winner to show that those votes allocated or assigned to him are actually real votes, so that there's some balance in terms of the legal efforts to establish the veracity of the outcome of that election? And I think, if I recall correctly, the Nigerian Bar Association sent a very powerful memo that there is need in this country to change the approach in terms of the burden of proof, and have a system of a burden of proof that creates more equilibrium between the two parties. I think it's really a difficult legal problem. I'm not a lawyer, and I wouldn't be able to go far in that argument, but there's certainly room for reflection and reform in that regard.
Well, it's certainly an interesting thought. Let's move to the governors-elect. They're gathering in Abuja to collect their certificates of return from the Electoral Commission, INEC. Obviously, it's not about getting the job, it's about what you do with it. You delivered a speech earlier in the year at the 20th Media Trust Dialogue, in which you gave reasons why you believe that the next president, and by extension, I don't know whether that extends to the governors, is likely to fail. Tell us more.
Well, the argument I made is that when elections come and people have to choose the person to lead the country, there are a number of criteria that are important. One is the cognate experience of the people involved. The second is character and integrity. Because governance is really about service to the people. And when you look at somebody's background, you can tell whether that person has a character of service to community. What has that person done in his community? What has he done in his professional career? What are the vibes about that person out there? And when I looked at a lot of the candidates, I felt strongly that many of them don't have the character, don't have the integrity to rule in a way that they will be of service to the people of this country.
And do you feel that way about the current president-elect?
Well, the way I'll address it is to say the current president-elect has been elected by Nigerians, and if the courts don't say otherwise, he's going to exercise that power. The fact of the matter is this. If the people elect somebody of poor character, poor integrity, they've made a choice. I will feel that that's not the best choice. But the fact of the matter, what happens is that is the choice made by the majority of people that's the important choice. At this point, because elections have taken place, I'm no longer trying to advise people to look at for people of character and integrity. All I will say is that we'll wait and see, and that maybe we may be pleasantly surprised.
Well, let me take you up on that wait and see thing that you just mentioned. Can you give us a flight of fancy about how we get from this point to the next as a way of speculatively looking into the future?
I think one of the most important issues, and that's partly why I feel these elections we've just had are very important elections. For the first time, we started having serious discussions at all levels about who do I vote for. And people started saying, no, let's not act as we acted previously and say, okay, I support this party, therefore all their candidates, I will vote for them because that's the party I want to support. And let's assess each of the candidates. And a lot of people started making the argument that, okay, for state assembly, I think the candidate of this party is the best, Party A. For Senate, I think Party B has a better candidate. So I'll choose for that candidate when it comes for Senate. For the presidency, Party C, I think, has a very interesting candidate. And that's really the discussion about building a responsive and responsible political leadership. We have for too long simply followed the party line that, okay, people have decided we are in this party. Forget the fact that often the people never sat to discuss it. I'm very proud that Nigerians are now saying, let's look closely at the candidates, let's look at their competence, let's look at their background, let's look at their character and integrity, and let those all be elements that will help us make our decisions. This is what's called civic culture. And it is the civic culture deployed by citizens that creates the basis for real democracy in society. When that civic culture deepens, and citizens begin to make very clear, informed decisions about who should exercise leadership, then you will have increased hope for democracy that works for the people.
And on that note, I want to thank you exceedingly. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a noted psephologist, professor of political science, chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper, and senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development.